I'm sure most of these images are familiar to you. This is a glimpse of how our lives look like today. Our banking, our social media, our work, and of course, the possible threats to those very livelihoods. My friend once told me that he lost his savings at BDO because the digital infrastructure of the bank got hacked. Another friend got her Facebook hacked, her identity stolen, and it almost completely ruined her reputation in social media. This is the type of loss we experience in a society where our experiences have become more and more digital. People have and will continue to lose livelihoods if safeguards are not in place. That is why we must care. That is why policy should be created with people in mind, to protect people from the new threats to their livelihoods, rather than being created for the sake of compliance. This is how care is something that could be manifested, not just in person-to-person relationships, but also in government-to-people relations as well. This is institutional care. Our discussion is anchored in the pursuit of a better future, one that aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals, such as SDGs 3, 4, 8, 9, 11, but particularly SDG 16 on peace and strong institutions. These are not just abstract goals, they are a promise of safety, dignity, and opportunity for every individual. The consciousness of the people-level impacts could demonstrate this need for policies that truly address and affect the people. And that is why we began our study of the people-level impacts of cyber governance in selected ASEAN countries, observations from 2014 to 2024. The governance of the Philippines may be often unanticipatory and unable to provide or enhance current foundations and safeguards, which could lead to distrust in systems and institutions. If that's the case physically, what could it be like digitally? In our case, to mitigate this distrust and loss, care is the presence of policy, because people suffer when there are no policies in place. In order to understand why this is, in this study, we looked at the people-level impacts through the lens of the socio-cultural, i.e. population demographics, and economic, i.e. migration, food security, and economic performance indicators. These indicators are not just numbers, they are direct reflections of SDG 4, 3, 2, and 8. For example, a higher GDP, or GNI, could translate to more stable jobs, higher incomes for families, better public services, and a government with more capacity to invest in healthcare and education. These things tell a story about the human experience and shows us the avenues where governance could show care. To further understand this, allow me to outline our objectives. First, to assess ASEAN countries considered in the study by considering these social indicators. Second, to compare and contrast the cybersecurity policies of ASEAN countries considered in the study. And third, to determine if the presence or absence of cyber governance in the last 10 years result to positive changes in the ASEAN countries' social indicators. Our research sought to observe whether the presence and consistency of cyber governance policies across ASEAN from 2014 to 2024 could be linked to improvements in key economics and socio-cultural indicators, namely net migration, food importation rates, GDP, GNI, literacy rates, and maternal mortality, with the goal of shedding light on how these digital policies translate to people-level impacts in a region. To achieve these goals, we approached it through the lens of the Comprehensive Impact Assessment by Kenyon et al. 2006, which provides the foundation by defining what kind of impact, whether it's economic or social-cultural, a policy has at the people level. And the Dimensions of Impact Framework by Impact Frontiers 2024 builds on that by offering a framework to measure and evaluate those categorized impacts in terms of magnitude, what, depth, how much, and significance, contribution. Together, they enable the study to go beyond just identifying impacts to understanding their real-world significance and policy relevance. Both of the previously mentioned frameworks ensures that our research doesn't just identify the people-level impacts, but also evaluates them in terms of depth, scale, and contribution. This also allows other researchers to compare policies across studies in measuring policy outcomes by clustering the ASEAN countries and contrasting the presence or absence of their cybersecurity policies. This comparative scope would allow scientific discussion by showing how different governance strategies could produce different societal outcomes and impacts in the social indicators. To further ground our analyses, we employed the lens of the policy diffusion, constructivist, and regional complex theories. Linking these perspectives to policy realities and their tangible people-level impacts, this approach opens space for discussing how governance theories can be tested against real-world socio-economic indicators. By utilizing the caritative caring theory by Katie Erickson, we tied it all back to how governance and the presence of policy is a form of care. The theory emphasized that caring highlights the importance of treating every person with dignity, respect, and kindness, which then creates trust, which is a meaningful relationship between people that could result in growth. To care is to allow spaces for people to grow. To care is to prevent and mitigate losses in the human experience. And to care is the presence of policy. Our approach was grounded in quantitative analysis and descriptive research design using secondary data and credible international and regional sources. Since cyber governance is an extension of governance, we mapped the presence or absence of cyber governance policies in 10 ASEAN countries and benchmarked the performance across the selected indicators. Although some countries had missing data, we addressed this by applying imputation techniques and calculating projected figures. Policy review and classification allowed us to compare countries with consistent versus inconsistent cyber governance frameworks, with cross-sectional patterns examined over a 10-year period. This could allow further theoretical discussions of cyber governance in observable real-world impacts. For each of the objectives listed, we found out the following. First, countries with consistent cyber governance policies demonstrated stronger economic performance, particularly in GDP and GNI, compared to those with inconsistent cyber governance presence. No strong or persistent pattern was found between cyber governance presence and either migration rates or maternal mortality, as results varied across countries. Second, findings show a commonality in the articulation and coverage of cyber governance policies among the ASEAN countries, noting that these policies are only usually penetrating the intermediate level of the comprehensive impact assessment. While ASEAN converges institutionally in terms of CERT's ISO standards and CII protection, divergence appears in purpose and enforcement, some prioritizing economic effects and others socio-political effects. Lastly, consistent states were also more likely to achieve 2 or more positive outcomes in people-level impacts than those with inconsistent frameworks, with Brunei and Myanmar consistently lagging in both economic and socio-cultural measures. With our findings suggesting that ASEAN states that practice cyber governance generally do better in social indicators than countries who do not, proves that governance does have an effective, positive, tangible effect on the people-level impacts. That is why governance is such a vital act of care. It is a complex system of processes, institutions, and practices through which power is exercised, and a country, organization, or group is directed and controlled to mitigate loss and maintain order. Under the umbrella of governance also includes cyber governance. If governance is care, then cyber governance as an extension and one of the examples of governance could be the exemplification of that care. Under the umbrella of cyber governance, then, is where the need for policies in the cyberspace arises. In a world where our lives are becoming more digitalized, where people clamor and urge for policies and safeguards in the face of new digitized threats in the cyberspace, this is how we care. The emergence of cyber governance is one of the first steps of transition to a new digital era. Ultimately, governance at its core is really just a question of care. How do governants protect their people, build trust, and create conditions for human growth? That is why the findings of our research are so important. Despite facing limitations due to gaps in data across certain social indicators, such as the maternal mortality and net migration in certain ASEAN states, through imputation, we were still able to project the figures. This allowed us to find out patterns suggesting that governance is not only about rules and order, but also about how these policies have actual effects on improvements to human lives, and how these policies could be created to improve people-level impacts and collective well-being. Building on these insights, future research could go past current limitations and enrich our understanding even further. To do this, we recommend to consider applying more detailed methods of data collection and validation to minimize inconsistencies across ASEAN countries, as variations in reporting could affect the comparability of results. Second, conducting country-level studies could provide greater clarity on why consistent cyber governance aligns more strongly with economic indicators compared to social-cultural indicators. And thirdly, examining how institutional practices, levels of enforcement, or even differences in governance capacity may interpret the variation in outcomes observed across member states. I'd like to end with a quote that was said many, many years ago, but is still relevant today. The care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only object of good government, by Thomas Jefferson. Even back then, governance as care has already been a concept that people believed in, and yet today, it is something that is still not commonly felt among the people. So the question is, if we don't care now, then when? With this, here are our references flashing on the screen right now. If you have any questions or are interested in further discussion, here is our contact information. We are grateful for your attention. Thank you.